Good afternoon. Hey, so I'm Professor Steve Haynes. I teach in the Department of Religious Studies, and I'm also on the search staff. This is a search plenary lecture, but it's also, we've invited members of the campus community to come here because one of the things I'm going to try to do is connect where we are in search right now, which is Genesis, with some larger conversations going on our campus this semester, which have to do with Benjamin Palmer, one of our founders and an important person on our campus, and the namesake for the administration building, which we're all familiar with. So the title of the lecture is Benjamin Palmer and the Curse of Ham, How Genesis Became a Pro-Slavery Text. I'll be talking about the ancient world, the 19th century, contemporary issues, so we have a lot to cover. Let's get started. I want to begin by reminding you search students of something that Professor Gray mentioned in our last plenary lecture, which had to do with the worlds of a text, particularly ancient texts. And I want to distinguish, as he did, between the world behind the text, the world of the text, and the world in front of the text, and say a little bit about what each of those mean and the kinds of questions that scholars or readers ask in each of these scenarios. We think about the world behind the text, if we're talking about Genesis, scholars are interested in asking, how did the final form of the text that we have in our Bibles come to be? In particular, they're interested in literary sources. You've read about the documentary hypothesis, JEDP, these different presumed or purported sources that have been woven together, edited, and to create the final form. Behind those, there may be oral traditions that it is useful to and interesting to try to locate. And then think about the life settings and the life of ancient Israel from which these oral traditions arose. And then finally, try to get some sense of what the connection is between these traditions and the actual events, places, and people that they describe. If we're focused on the text itself, there are other questions we ask. One has to do with genre. What sort of genre are we dealing with a particular story, for instance? What themes are there and what themes recur throughout an extended text like Genesis? What are the literary elements that we can identify? One is wordplay. Your Bible, the NOAB Bible, indicates that there are some word plays, some connections in Hebrew that don't come across very well in English, but they're clearly part of the textual dynamics there. And then I want to talk today about textual gaps. These are gaps in stories, unanswered questions that are present in text that readers naturally try to fill. And as they fill them, some of the answers to these, some of the filling of these gaps take on sort of a momentum of their own. And finally, talk about social applications of these texts. And in the case of Genesis 9 through 11, you may not know these texts very well, but they have had a very strong influence historically, and in some cases a very pernicious influence. So we want to talk about how textual gaps are filled by readers, and how readers respond to texts, and how this history of interpretation gets going. So that's the world in front of the text. That's where my interests mainly lie for today. And we're really looking at three different stories that make up this section of Scripture we're focusing on. The first one is the so-called Curse of Ham, Genesis 9, 18 through 28. The second is the so-called Table of Nations in Genesis 10, and the Tower of Babel story in Genesis 11, 1 through 9. Now this altogether is fewer than 50 verses. It's not a huge chunk of text, and it's part of the text, if you were reading through Genesis, you might be tempted to jump over. The Ham story, Curse of Ham story is interesting. The Table of Nations, not so much. It's a series of genealogies. So-and-so was the father of so-and-so, was the father of so-and-so. The Tower of Babel story is also interesting, but it's brief. And what I want to talk about is how these stories have been brought together by readers and given sort of an overarching theme. So if we think about the world in front of the text, Genesis 9 through 11, we've been reading Genesis, the first 8 chapters, and there's some themes and some textual issues that have already been introduced that we want to keep in mind. One of them is sibling conflict. You remember Genesis 4, right? Cain and Abel. What happens there? I'll give you a hint. It's not good. What happens between the brothers? Cain kills his brother. Yeah, that's sibling conflict taken to the nth degree, right? So we're already prepared for conflict between brothers. We've been introduced to the idea of curses. We have a curse in Genesis 3. We have another one in 4 on Cain for murder. So when this curse arises in Genesis 9, we're not entirely surprised. There's this fear of human beings becoming like God. We find this in chapters 2 and 6. In 6, where the sons of God decide to sort of come down to earth and intermarry with the daughters of men. So there's all these these boundary crossing stories. And then separation in chapter 1, we have God separating land from sea and day from night and so forth. And we're going to find this again in Genesis 10 and 11 of God separating peoples and making distinctions and so forth. And the gaps that we might look for, I want to illustrate by talking about chapter 4. There are 2 textual gaps in chapter 4 in the discussion of the story of Cain and Abel that are very striking. One is that the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering had no regard. Why is that? We don't know. The text doesn't tell us. We can only guess, right? Even the annotations in the NOAB suggest that, we're not really sure why this happened. It was important, obviously, certainly to Cain. A more interesting gap has to do with the mark that God put on Cain after his murder of Abel to make sure that he wasn't killed in retaliation. What was the mark of Cain? That's absolutely correct. We have no idea, right? There's nothing in the text to suggest what it is. Now, readers have wanted to answer that question, and there's a whole tradition of purported marks of Cain, which we won't get into. But the point is that these textual gaps sort of call out for being filled. I'm interested in the world today and the world in front of the text, particularly with regard to Genesis 9 through 11. And so we want to think about textual gaps, how they've been filled by readers, and how those gaps have contributed to interpretive traditions that have gained momentum over time, and how these traditions reflect readers' needs or social locations. And we're going to get finally in this lecture to the question of slavery in the 19th century and how white Bible readers in the South saw in Genesis, and particularly in chapters 9 through 11, texts that spoke to their need to have a biblical defense for slavery, a biblical apology for slavery. Slavery was under attack, had been under attack for a couple of decades by abolitionists, and people who were Southerners, were Christians, who believed the Bible was authoritative, wanted to have some strong reasons for supporting slavery, some strong biblical reasons, and they used these particular texts to fill that bill. So why Benjamin Palmer? Most of you are first-year students. You've probably heard about Palmer Hall. You may not be familiar with why this is of any concern to anyone on our campus. Basically, this is a person who was very much a part of our history. He was called to be the first chancellor or the first president of the institution of Southwestern Presbyterian University in 1874. He ended up turning down that offer. He was forced to because his church wouldn't let him go. But he did serve on the board of trustees for 2 decades. He's credited with the college's emphasis on teaching the Bible, which is interesting because that emphasis is one reason you're sitting here today. The fact that we have a search course, the fact that that search course is so Bible, hey, my wife came. That's a really surprise. Only took me about 10 slides to realize it. The reason we have a search course and the reason the Bible is so much a part of it really goes back to Benjamin Palmer in the 19th century. And of course, his name is given to the first building on this campus in 1925. And this is a claim I want to make about Palmer that I hope gives some context for understanding his broader importance. He did as much as anybody in the 19th century in filling out this world in front of the text for Genesis 9 through 11 in a pro-slavery way, in a way that was compatible with slavery, with segregation, and with white supremacy. So if you walk into Palmer Hall from the south, that is from the side where Deal's statue is, and you look quickly to the right, and you have really good eyesight, you can see the Palmer Memorial Tablet. It's, as you can tell, sort of dark. This is the way it reads: "To the glory of God and in grateful recognition of the generosity of the people of New Orleans, by whom this building was erected in memory of Benjamin Morgan Palmer. For 45 years, pastor of the First Presbyterian Church of New Orleans, born in Charleston, South Carolina, 1818, 200 years ago this year, died in New Orleans, 1902. The father of this institution, which was the first to place the Bible as a required textbook in its curriculum, and which through all the years continues to enshrine this ideal of Christian education. A patriot, a scholar, an educator, an ecclesiastical statesman, and a pulpit orator unsurpassed. We'll talk more about what it means for Palmer to be the father of the institution. Let's talk about the Bible as a required textbook. This is a page out of the bulletin catalog for Southwestern Presbyterian University, the predecessor of Rhodes, in 1875, as it reopened after the Civil War. And so what you see is a description of the curriculum, 4 years of study. Obviously, it's very heavy on Latin and Greek, a little bit of philosophy. As you get further in your course, you take mathematics and natural science and history. That's very classically oriented. But what and that is what you would see just about any college of Rhodes size during this time. What you wouldn't see is this line underneath which says biblical course through all the collegiate classes for 4 years. This was an innovation. It was new. It was something that reflected Palmer's own view of higher education, and it was something that Rhodes advertised as a distinctive throughout the years. And it changed over time so that after World War I, it was only a 2-year requirement, what was called at the time freshman Bible and senior Bible, and eventually merged into this sort of basic humanities requirement that we have, but we still very much live with the legacy of this innovation. So let's talk about these texts. The first one in Genesis 9, which is a pretty brief but dramatic text. The sons of Noah who went out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These 3 were the sons of Noah. And from these the whole earth was peopled. Noah, a man of the soil, was first to plant a vineyard. So remember the context we're reading from here. The flood has basically wiped out everybody, right? All human beings who resulted from the original creation are gone, and now Noah's family, 8 of them in total, his 3 sons and all their wives, are starting over. And so the hope is that it's a better start than the first one, which didn't go so well with a garden and all that. Starts off simply enough, but almost immediately things go awry. He, Noah, drank some of the wine that he had cultivated, became drunk, and lay uncovered in his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his 2 brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backwards and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness. The text describes pretty much what you see here in the illustration. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed by the Lord my God be Shem, and let Canaan be his slave. May God make space for Japheth, and let him live in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his slave." So this is the story, and then it moves on. Lots of textual gaps. Let's count them. The first and perhaps the most important one is, what does it mean to say that Ham saw the nakedness of his father? Is this a description, a literal description of what happened, or is this a euphemistic reference to something else that occurred that's not made explicit in the text? Secondly, how did Noah know what his youngest son had done to him? He's passed out, right, drunk. He wakes up and immediately he knows. Did he just have a hunch? Did someone tell him? Was there some mark on his body about what had happened? So what did Ham actually do to Noah, in other words? If Ham is the culprit, why is Canaan cursed? Really interesting question, right? Because Canaan is definitely the recipient of the curse, but it's Ham who, according to the text, is the one who's the transgressor. And doesn't Noah share some of the blame, right? He is, after all, laying there naked in front of his sons. This question about what Ham did is a textual gap that really entices readers to make stuff up, right? And I think you could argue that the text itself invites a kind of sexual reading of the transgression, with the talk of nakedness and so forth. So among the possibilities that are broached in the history of interpretation are that Ham castrated Noah. This would certainly get his attention, explains why he might wake up and be upset. Perhaps he saw him having sex with his wife, with Ham's mother. Perhaps Ham committed incest with his own mother. This is a suggestion for maybe what the term saw the nakedness of his father meant, that it was sort of a circumlocution for that. Perhaps Ham used magic to render his father impotent. This again would get his attention. Or maybe he had sex on the ark in violation of Noah's command. So this story gets going, this tale gets going early on that Noah had said, while we're on the ark, for however long it takes to ride this thing out, no sex. And Ham, being Ham, couldn't abide by that, and so he sneaks over to where his wife is being housed, and they have sex. And what makes this story a little compelling is that perhaps Canaan was the result of that, and that it explains why Canaan is cursed rather than Ham, right? You see the logic there from reader's perspective? Was Noah at fault? No, not really. Here's why. In the history of interpretation, Noah is one of those figures in the Old Testament that Christians see as a type of Christ, as a forerunner of Christ. And he's an obvious one because of the association of water and baptism and wood and the cross and so forth. So you have already in the 2nd century this quote by Justin Martyr: as Christ regenerated a new race through water and faith and wood, Noah was saved by wood when he rode over the waters with his household. So anything Noah does is sort of seen as being good and righteous. And so he's not a good candidate for being vilified. So here we are at Genesis 10. Again, this chapter that it's tempting to look over. It starts off by saying this, what follows is the account of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons, who themselves had sons after the flood, and then those are listed. And then the end of chapter 10, after this review of the descendants of Noah has concluded, we read, these are the families of Noah's sons according to their genealogies in their nations. So each ancestor being responsible for a sort of nation of people that emerges. And from these, the nations spread abroad on the earth after the flood. So in other words, the earth is repeopled by Noah's sons. There's one thing in Genesis 10 that is oddly out of place. It's a little chunk of text, of tradition, that is inserted in here, and it's about a character named Nimrod. I was told after the first lecture by one of my students in my colloquium, that the term Nimrod came into common parlance from a cartoon, and I can't remember now which one it is. Was it Bugs Bunny or something like that? I don't know. Not so important. But Nimrod's identity comes down to us through Genesis 10. He gets 3 verses, which is more than anybody else in Genesis 10 gets. Cush, the son of Ham, one of Ham's 4 sons, became the father of Nimrod. He was the first on earth to become a mighty warrior. He was a mighty warrior, mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore, it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, and Akkad, and all of them in the land of Shinar. So this is an odd little bit of tradition to have in there, but it's going to become very important when we think about a connection with the next chapter, which has to do with the Tower of Babel. So let's review what Genesis 10 suggests, especially if we take Genesis as being an accurate description of history and how humanity unfolded. We're all descendants of Noah, right? Since they were the only ones to survive the flood. And since Genesis 10 tells us how they sort of migrated to populate the world, we can all trace ourselves back to one of those. This is a sort of spatial depiction of what Genesis 10 tells us, right? That the descendants of Shem went sort of to the southeast, the descendants of Japheth to the north, and the descendants of Ham to the southwest, basically in northeastern Africa. So this was the sort of known world that the Hebrews were familiar with, and so this was their description of how it was repeopled after the flood. This description of the world after the flood is taken up in the Middle Ages as a pretty accurate description of what the world looks like, how it's shaped, and how it's peopled. This is a map, believe it or not, from the 6th century, a little symmetrical map that was put together by Isidore of Seville, which describes, it's a little odd because east is up top and west is at the bottom, so it's tilted. But you have Asia and Shem in one corner, Europe and Japheth in the other, Africa and Ham in the other. So basically there are 3 types of people. There are 3 areas of the earth, and these are how they are linked to each other. So even in the 15th century, there's a map that comes from that period as Europeans got a better sense of what the world actually looked like geographically, they still associated these regions with the sons of Noah, sorry. So up on the top left corner is Japheth, associated with generally where we see Europe, Shem over on the right top, and then Ham around the bottom. So you still have this association, these folks. Those of you who are about my age will remember My Three Sons. It was one of the best sitcoms of the 60s, and it was funny. It was also typical of families. You had three sons with different characters. There's the oldest kid. There's the oldest kid who is sort of the hero child and the overachiever. The middle child is kind of mischievous, always getting in trouble, and the young kid is a little dork who's like always following dad around, right, and getting protected by him. This is kind of the way people began to think about Noah's sons, as having distinct characters, so that we could understand types of people by their association with Noah's sons. So for instance, in the 12th century, it was suggested that perhaps the free people come from Shem, soldiers from Japheth, servants of Ham, and that would fit at least with Noah's curse. In Chartres Cathedral, we see a similar kind of understanding on the left-hand side, three sons with three different sorts of missions, those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. But inevitably, however you thought of this division of humanity, Ham is always going to end up being assigned the aspects of human character that are negative. Right? So, for instance, Ham is the one who's disobedient. Ham is the one who invents magic, or at least carries magic through the flood, right? Is responsible for it existing post-flood. He's the one responsible for idolatry, for paganism, superstition, and of course for sexual perversion. And you don't need to look too much past the story in Genesis 9 to get that connection. So eventually, Noah's sons become associated with three distinct racial types. So it's particularly in the age of exploration, as Europeans began to discover that there were people who looked very different than they did. This idea of three different sons became racialized so that we have Hamites being black, Shemites being sort of some color in the middle, Japhethites being white, and so you have accounted for all the different varieties of at least skin color. And this idea becomes common that the word kam in Hebrew means black, which it really doesn't. It means something more like hot. But this idea that there are three general races of humankind fits nicely onto the template of Noah's sons. And that takes some interesting turns. You probably are familiar with the story of the Magi from Matthew chapter 1. This idea that these men, these wise men of the East, travel to pay homage to Jesus. There's nothing about them in the text of Matthew to describe them in any way. Their names, their countries, or certainly what they look like. But in medieval iconography, they take on these three racial types. So you have one black, one white, and one sort of brown. Again, this assumption that there are three human types, and ultimately they go back to Noah's sons. So then we get to the 19th century. This idea of racial types being descended from Noah becomes very helpful. This is a depiction of the three sons of Noah from a book by a man named Josiah Priest, who wrote in the 1850s. And he doesn't really explain how it is that Noah and Noah's wife had sons of three different races, but it's very clear to him that this is what happened. And this is how he depicts it. On the left, you see Ham. In the middle, the guy looks like Abe Lincoln, is Japheth, and then Shem is this Jesus-looking dude on the right. So this was a way of sort of illuminating, illustrating what the three sons of Noah may have looked like and how they explain the relationship of peoples to this day. If you go online, you can find clip art that reflects this tradition even today. This is what fascinates me about the world in front of the text. Because the people who put together, who drew these things, probably have no idea that the racialization of Noah's sons has any kind of important history. They're just sort of aware of it and they reproduce it. So kids in Sunday school could be learning that, Noah's 3 sons were of different races without any pernicious intent. But it's part of and parcel of this long history of tradition that has had a lot of negative influence. So let's talk about Genesis 11. This is the story of the Tower of Babel. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." In other words, what will happen to us will happen to the sons of Noah as they were dispersed across the world. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which mortals had built. And the Lord said, "Look, they are one people. They have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do now will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language there so that they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. Now in my colloquium, we've been talking a lot about etiologies. There are quite a few in the early chapters of Genesis, right? There's the snake, the explanation for why the snake crawls on its belly, why women have pain in childbirth, why men have to sort of eke out a living among thorns and thistles. There's the rainbow story, the explanation of the rainbow. Etiologies are stories that explain the origins of something. And this is clearly on one level an etiology, right? It explains how it is that if everybody is descended from Noah, and presumably they spoke the same language, that family, then there came a time when people spoke very different languages. How did that happen? Well, this is a story to explain that. But it also is a way to bring these texts in Genesis 9 through 11 together in ways that they may not have been intended. So one of the textual gaps from Genesis 10 is, why did Nimrod get so much press, right? He's the only figure in Genesis 10 that gets any sort of long description. And then who led the Babel builders, right? Who was responsible for this? And you remember what it says about Nimrod, where his kingdom began? There was a reference to Shinar, but there's also a reference to Babel. So readers thought, very early in the history of interpretation, well, he started at Babel. Maybe the Tower of Babel was his doing. So there's this connection that's made, basically a character without a story, Nimrod, right? Is joined up with a story without a character, the Tower of Babel. So the mythology that develops around this is that Nimrod is the tower builder. So this is how this works. This is an illumination of a manuscript from the 13th century, and it describes the sons of Noah. You have Ham, his 4 sons, and then Nimrod. And how is Nimrod depicted? With a tower. That's how the history of interpretation sort of gets going, how it gets embedded in people's minds, and how it's transmitted. This is a quote from Dante. You'll read Dante later this year. I think it's the last thing we read in Search in the first year. And Dante is, the Inferno is a story of Dante's visit to hell, and his guide is Virgil, and he goes deeper and deeper into hell till he gets to basically the center of it, the center of the earth, the bottom of hell, and he encounters these giants. And one of the giants he encounters is Nimrod. Remember, he's described as a mighty hunter, so the idea is that he's very large. And Dante hears him babbling. Why is he babbling? He's babbling because he's the one responsible for the Tower of Babel. And so this connection between Nimrod and the tower is made, and it becomes quite permanent. So here's a picture of the Tower of Babel. You can see it in the background. In the foreground, you see this guy in a robe who's a king. Obviously, Nimrod sort of deciding what to do now that God has apparently already destroyed the temple. So Nimrod becomes associated with rebellion, with resistance of the dispersion God wants to see happen. Because Shinar is in Semitic land given to Shem, Nimrod becomes associated with usurping other people's land. He becomes associated with idolatry, hunting, and tyranny, all these things. And then, of course, eventually, Nimrod is racialized. He is a Hamite, grandson of Ham through Cush, And if he's going to be used in an argument for slavery or for an argument about the character of Hamites, then he needs to be explicitly racialized. And this is how Josiah Priest does it. You can see this conversation happening in front of the tower, and you can't probably see it very well, but it's a black man trying to explain something to a white man. It's basically Nimrod directing, how the temple should be built. And this is another one of Priest's depictions of Nimrod to sort of give us a sense in which he was not only a tyrant, but also a hunter, sort of a brute character. So the question comes up, why is it that 19th century pro-slavery apologists were so attracted to this part of Scripture, Genesis 9 through 11? And there are several reasons. One, I think the central one is this, that although slavery is mentioned a great deal in the Bible, it's mentioned about 35 times in Genesis, for instance, there's only one place in the Hebrew Bible where slavery and race seem to come together, and that's in the story of Ham's curse. Now, we can argue that there really is no racial element there, which is true of the original text, but this is where race and slavery were thought to intersect. And these chapters were applicable not just to ancient Israel, but to all societies, right? They describe a time right after the flood when all our descendants are involved. Noah was seen as a planter and a patriarch, so he had some resonance for 19th century white men. And Ham, or Canaan, whoever you think is responsible for the act, is described as acting without honor, right? He dishonors his father. And this is how 19th century Southern slavery advocates saw slaves as lacking honor and therefore deserving their plight. So back to Palmer. So one of the things that was said in the Palmer Memorial Tablet about Palmer was that he was a patriot. He certainly was, certainly a Southern patriot, a scholar, an educator, an ecclesiastical statesman, and a pulpit orator unsurpassed. This last part is really interesting. Palmer, by all accounts, was a mesmerizing speaker, and the thing that made him even more impressive is that he never used notes of any kind. He didn't take notes into the pulpit with him. He didn't take notes when he was speaking at some gathering or rally. The only reason that we have the text of his speeches and lectures is because people insisted that they be published. And so later he would write them down. But by all contemporary accounts, he was a remarkable speaker. He spoke seamlessly. He spoke in riveting images. And even though he was not impressive to look at, he was small of stature, not very attractive, but his voice was remarkable, and people by the thousands turned out to hear him speak. So in the 1850s, Palmer finds himself in New Orleans. He had grown up in South Carolina, but he finds himself in New Orleans at a large church with a very impressive reputation. And he's a fairly young man. He's about 40. And he starts speaking across the South in ways that bring a lot of attention. In particular, he's speaking about slavery. Palmer had gone to Amherst College, like a lot of Southerners before the Civil War, went to North to go to college. He had a terrible experience there. He found like he was constantly having to defend his views. So he became very good at trying to shore up the moral foundations of slavery. And there was no better way to do that than to show that slavery was rooted in the Bible. And this is what he set out to do in the 1850s. So this was from a speech he gave not far from here in LaGrange, Tennessee. Each of the three divisions into which the human family was separated after the flood has been occupied with a distinct mission throughout the entire tract of their history. The race of Shem was providentially selected as a channel for transmitting religion and worship. This is the branch that the Hebrews come from, and later Jesus. Japhet and his race seem designated to be the organ of human civilization and cultivating the intellectual powers. And the descendants of Ham, on the contrary, in whom the sensual and corporeal appetites predominate, are driven like an infected race beyond the deserts of Sahara, or under a glowing sky, nature harmonizes with their brutal and savage disposition. So he doesn't speak about slavery directly here, but it's very clear that he's suggesting that these descendants of Ham are fit for slavery. And then he talks about the importance of the South's role in conserving slavery. I'll let you read this while I talk. Basically, there were different ideas about slavery in the South. Some people thought it was a necessary evil. Well, different views among non-slaves. People thought it was a necessary evil. Some thought, well, it will just eventually sort of will evolve away from it. And some people believed it was a positive good. This was the camp Palmer found himself in, that it was something that was a good for everybody, for blacks and for whites. It was something that had been determined by God. It was something that Christians in the South needed to preserve at all costs. So as the Civil War gets going, Palmer starts to double down on this language about slavery and about the South's special mission to preserve it. He says in a famous speech in June 1861, "If we ascend the stream of history to its source, we find in Noah's prophetic utterances to his three sons the fortunes of mankind presented in perfect outline. Upon Ham was pronounced the doom of perpetual servitude, proclaimed with double emphasis, as it is twice repeated, he shall be the servant of Japheth and servant of Shem." So, in other words, slavery is not just defensible, not just economically advantageous, it is the will of God, and we know that going back to Genesis 9. Now, as slavery, as the South's sort of fortunes in the Civil War became more difficult, particularly in 1863, Palmer really felt the need to sort of defend the South as a separate entity, cultural entity, and that it needed to be separate. And he uses Genesis 10 to do this. He says, "In the organic law under which human governments were constituted by God, not consolidation but separation is recognized as a regulative and determining principle." In other words, the South belongs separate. It needs to have its own culture, its own mores, because this is God's will for peoples. We know that from Genesis 10. Then he says, "Let it be observed, moreover, that the first public and recorded crime of post-Diluvian history was the attempt to thwart God's revealed purpose of separation, that is, in the Tower of Babel. This is the first crime recorded, and that God showed what he thought about consolidation, about bringing people together, about unity. He destroyed that temple." After the war, most people in the South who had used the Bible to advocate for slavery realized that there was no need to do that anymore, and even if there were, the story of Ham seemed to have no relevance because there was no need to talk about slavery. What Palmer did that was unique, and this is one way he stands out from other people of the time, is that Palmer believed that these chapters in Genesis were still relevant for understanding the relationship of the races. And in a speech at Washington and Lee in 1872, he talks about segregation in these terms. "The argument for this policy of preserving the purity of the race I base upon the declared policy of the divine administration from the days of Noah until now. The sacred writings clearly teach that to prevent the amazing wickedness which brought upon the earth the purgation of the flood, the deluge, God saw fit to break the human family into sections. And that's still God's will," he says. So at a time when segregation was still not fully legalized, and Palmer used his influence, his credibility to argue that this was actually the divine will for the South. And he says, we know it's God's will because when Nimrod came along and tried to do something different, tried to overcome this separation and bring consolidation, God intervened and destroyed the tower. So the last time that Palmer uses this curse was at the very end of his life. The last time he refers to it in a sermon he did in New Orleans in 1901 called the Century Sermon. Thousands of people showed up to hear him. And he uses this section of scripture not so much to talk about blacks and slavery and segregation, but to talk about the destruction of Native Americans, which by this time was just about complete on the continent. He says, "Almost before the waters of the deluge had subsided from the face of the earth, you have the tripart division of the human race, all yet to be born, signalized in the destinies assigned to the three sons of Noah." And then he refers to Genesis 9, servitude to the first, enlargement to the second, and a sort of priestly function assigned to the third. So he says servitude, not slavery, but some kind of secondary position, certainly in society, certainly indicating white supremacy. And then he talks about how God had removed the Canaanites from the chosen people's, land, promised land, and how this was basically an analogy for how we should understand the destruction of Native Americans. Okay, so how is Palmer remembered? These are the ways that I know of, the things that I've seen. This is his crypt in New Orleans. I've visited. It's still there, and you can travel there and pay homage. You can order his books online. A lot of them are still published. You can order copies of his sermons, actually a book he wrote about James Henry Thornwell. If you go to New Orleans and you're curious, you can find a bed and breakfast that is in the house where he lived in the 1880s, and you can actually get married there or have your wedding reception there. There's a street named after him called Palmer Avenue, which is a very nice part of the Garden District. It's interesting that Palmer was run over by a streetcar on the corner of Canal Street and Palmer Avenue. He died there. Very interesting, one of the few people probably to die on a street named after him. He was the namesake of an orphanage that was founded at the end of the 19th century in Columbus, Mississippi. It's still there. It's called the Palmer Home for Children. If you find yourself eating lunch in the West Dining Hall and you look up over your left shoulder, you're likely to see Palmer peering down on you, and there are other portraits of Palmer around campus. And then we have Palmer Hall. This is the official description of why Palmer Hall is on Rhodes campus, why the first building was named Palmer Hall. This is Charles Deal, who was president from 1917 to 1949. The first building completed on the new campus in 1925 was the administration building, named Palmer Hall in honor of Dr. Benjamin Palmer, and provided for by the people of New Orleans. Dr. Palmer was pastor of the First Presbyterian Church of New Orleans, was a great preacher, and was well known and loved by people of all creeds and races. It's an interesting thing to say about a racist, that he was loved by people of all creeds and races. There's some truth to that. He was appreciated by many of New Orleans citizens as being sort of ecumenical in spirit. But clearly his views about race are not really done justice to in this description. So I want to think about buildings like Palmer Hall in the context of Confederate memorials that we find throughout the South. So this is a link to a website that's easily found. It's the Equal Justice Initiative out of Montgomery. And they have there a sort of interactive map of Confederate monuments. And I know it's hard to see, but I want to point out something very interesting. So you see the timeline at the bottom, the Civil War. So 1866, so in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, there were 2 Confederate monuments in the South. If we move to 1877, so the end of Reconstruction essentially, there were 52 monuments. It's quite a bit of growth, but not as much as we'll see as we go forward. If we go to 1920, the number is 956. So 900 Confederate monuments between 1877 and 1920. And then if we go to 1950, thank you, Dave, we find 1,360, another 500 or so, 400 or so. So clearly, the vast majority of Confederate monuments come up not in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, but during this period of Jim Crow, this period of racial terror in the South, when people were trying to reiterate, to reinstantiate the values of the Old South. And this is precisely when we find buildings like Palmer Hall being built. So I'm going to show you some of the buildings I've discovered just in the last few months as I've done this research that I think belong in the same class as Palmer Hall. So this is Thornwell Hall at the University of South Carolina, named after James Henry Thornwell, an important Presbyterian theologian, but also a USC faculty member and president. He died in 1862 during the war, and this building was dedicated in 1913. So put that in perspective of what I just said about Confederate monuments. Saunders Hall at the University of North Carolina, which has been in the news recently because the name was recently changed. The Carolina Hall is named for William L. Saunders, who was a Confederate colonel and chief organizer of the KKK in North Carolina. He died in 1891. This building was dedicated and named for him in 1922. Carr Hall at Duke University, also in the news now because some information about Julian Hall has come out, and the historians at Duke, who are headquartered in this building at Duke, want to change the name. He was a Confederate soldier, supporter of the KKK, advocate of violence and intimidation against African Americans, died in 1923. This building was dedicated in his name in 1924. Samford Hall at Auburn, named for William J. Samford, former governor and congressman, supporter of states' rights and black disenfranchisement. He died in 1901. This building's dedicated at Auburn in 1929. And finally, my alma mater, Vanderbilt. When I was there, there was a building that said Confederate Memorial Hall on it. It was very central. A few years ago, Vanderbilt repaid the money that had been given to the college to name this building Confederate Memorial Hall in order to take the word Confederate off. But this building was built in 1935 to house the daughters of Confederate veterans. And then finally, Palmer Hall, who died in 1902, dedicated in 1925, and as we know about Palmer, advocate of slavery and segregation, and a champion of the South's lost cause. So what I want to add to the conversation about Palmer Hall that's going on campus is not just a sense of what he believed and how he used the Bible to argue for slavery and white supremacy, but that honoring Palmer in 1925 really was an act that was freighted with a lot of meaning, right? It was a way of honoring someone who was really synonymous with the Old South, with Old South values, with the idea of the South's cause as being correct even though they lost. Palmer spoke a lot at Confederate reunions and was often celebrating the values of the Old South. To name a building after him in 1925 was not a mistake, was not an accident. It was an act that I think needs to be seen in the context of how Confederate monuments have sort of functioned in our region of the country more generally. And I would say that having Palmer Hall in the midst of a campus like ours in 2018 doesn't necessarily reflect anything about the intentions of the people here now, but it does suggest how easily white supremacy can become embedded in an institution, even one that's run by well-meaning and good people, and how difficult it is sometimes to sort of to tease that out. So we've got just a couple of minutes, and I'm happy to field any questions you have or comments. Yeah. Are there certain endowments that would be revoked yet? No, in a word, no. There was money that was donated, I think $25,000 at the time, which is probably $1 million in today's dollars. But some of our administrators have been in contact with the people there at First Church in New Orleans, and they feel, I think, largely the way we do about it, and so that probably is not a concern. It's a good question, though. Yeah. Yeah, right. So the dominant, I would say the dominant institution has been kind of, is it fair to say, has there ever been other institutions, it might have been the minority, has other people, for example, Africans, right? Yeah. Have they ever actually looked at that? Yeah, so the question is, have other interpretations about these texts existed and what has been their fate? I hate to say read my book. I hate when people say that. But in this case, because of the time I'm going to say that, it's really interesting because there have been some counter readings. And you think African Americans in particular in the 19th century wanted to read these stories in ways that sort of celebrated Africa and sort of identified, Africans in the Bible. And so there's a whole tradition about that. You're exactly right. Yeah. This is clearly a very a way of reading the text that speaks a lot about the readers themselves, much more than the text, right? Yeah. Probably time for one more. Thank you for your patience and your attention, and for your search folks, we'll see you soon.